Okay, so now we're going to have round 2 of debate. So I think in these last presentations, we've looked at time-based systems in a different way than we did in the first set. And I would like to ask that we address that a little bit, because in some way I think the thread of commonality between all the panelists is a sense of time frame that spans all the way from antiquity to now to behavioral-based models.
I want to just say something about the time frames which are operating. I think you saw it in my lecture. I'm very much conscious of history and a series of layered evolutionary processes, with some aspects being invariant from the very moment of becoming human all the way to today. I see that on a very, very general and abstract level, the built environment has the same empowering and structuring, demiurgic nearly force that all societies from then up to today evolve only with an evolving built environment and are dependent on that. At each stage, the civilization which has been achieved depends on its built environment, crucially and critically, and couldn't be sustained without the particular evolved, complex built environment it had achieved. Now sometimes, so there's some invariants, some standards. Another standard, I think, is what I call the semiological project, which was operating from day one also. So it's not only the spatial positioning, but it's also that you have this graphic nearly transformation of the human populace into types and subtypes, which you see, the kind of totemic inscriptions. They are invariants, and we still 100% depend on, for instance, the fashion system to navigate a much more complex world. It's very much a world which is evolving, and we all self-sort into it. It has much more degrees of variability. We have huge wardrobes and options and selections, etc. But there's also a human invariant. At the same time, there's a series of course, stages of civilization and history where new things, unheard of, new evolutionary achievements come forth, which put that onto a totally new trajectory. For instance, the emergence of writing and which literally civilizations, which becomes a precondition for architecture and drawing, etc. But then the emergence of drawing itself, which starts in the Renaissance, where for the first time we have fully drawn up and designs we can compare, speculate, and talk about. So and there's totally new things, and I think a moment like this is computation and the computational empowerment of a civilization. It's totally new beginning and new possibilities. At the same time, the invariants carry forth all the way from the beginning of civilization. So that's something we need to discuss and be aware of and fold into our architectural theorizing. And that's why I don't think Reinier is right as kind of saying we're going back to the moment of 1914, and in one dimension perhaps, but in many other dimensions there's something radically, it's basically, you can't turn back the clock.
Hi.
It's irreversible.
I have a question for you, Patrik. You talked about how it's important to use basically these new technologies of modeling how people interact with the built environment to create a kind of spatial order that will enforce or create a social order. But do you think that it's also necessary to make the environment able to like interact, become like participatory, maybe changeable, based on maybe a changing social order or changing norms, like the way that Theo was talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely right. And sometimes what I find interesting is when this becomes very obvious and palpable, that the elements of architecture, the world of products that are becoming active participants, with sensors and actuators and responsive actors, that opens a eye that maybe there always already have been, in a way, participants and actors, even though their behavior was a permanent broadcast of a certain posture and resistance and affordance. Right? So we kind of, but it becomes palpable with these new capacities. But there have always been capacities and affordances. But also we have to run with these new capacities, which also have something radically new. So it's always, what stays the same, what is new. So very good point. And I think it's important to see the open-endedness of the human project. In this sense, I'm an anti-humanist. We don't know where this civilization goes. Artificial intelligence. I'm not scared. I would run the risk and run with it and reinvent ourselves, individually and collectively, with these, let's say, with that new symbiosis, man-machine symbiosis, artificial intelligence, and empowering, enhancing us. Somebody out there asked me about architectural agency and whether this is kind of questions or reduced. No, it's empowered. Before we were kind of blind and couldn't simulate and predict what would happen. Now we have crowd modeling and artificial intelligence. We're much more empowered. We work through algorithms and systems and evolutionary algorithms, etc. That's an empowered form of agency. And that's not only happening in architecture as architects, it's happening in engineering, of course, it happens in all other domains, in other arenas of interaction, for instance, the financial sector, and its algorithmic trading and electronic money, and therefore architecture has to be participating in this. We can't rest. It's really highly problematic if some architects stand there because they don't see the capacity, they see the potential, and say that we're as good as 1950, nothing is new. I can do my architecture and do as good as anybody. A Chipperfield, a minimalist who kind of goes back to the 1950s repertoire. No, that borders on the insane. It's really, as I said earlier, it's like insisting on the postal system as a form of communication and rejecting social media.
I like that. I think you're the first person that has ever called David Chipperfield insane. So this remarkably reasonable, well-balanced, polite English gentleman, but I think it's a very interesting counterintuitive notion.
Yeah, I think it's probably also important to realize that if you engage in those technologies or not, once they're created, they're there. And I think as much as we would like to so-called go back, and I think that that's a kind of human tendency and it's a knee-jerk reaction to these things, I think it has to be taken on board that these things are out there. It's not necessarily about championing them, but actually just trying to understand them. And through that, I think that there are opportunities. So I may take some criticism about the smart city, and actually, if I'm really honest with you, the people that work on smart cities are not necessarily the people that should be working on them. And part of that, I think, is also to have a much more open conversation about how actually one really participates. And I think that these are really important, and they're very important for the younger generation. So I think people can look at the idea of practice and education and actually knowing the people that are standing here on this side of the table. I mean, they're all very much vested in research, which is a kind of unstated thing, but that's also a way of kind of exploring some of these ideas and see what actually resonates.
But I kind of wonder how, though, because I mean, I'm assuming, just for debate's sake, if anything,
Sure.
that impartially in going back to the 1950s, you talk about Chipperfield, but let's say you're at least implying that that was also the point that I was making. I think, in all fairness, that the statement that you can go back in history is as simplistic as the statement or the assumption that history has any linear progression, which I have a feeling that a lot of the people who it's one thing to celebrate new technology, and we are in no way, we have our own way of looking at a lot of technologies, and certainly do not consciously cultivate an ignorance about them, but it's just a matter of how, and it's just a matter of, how quickly do you allow to think yourselves that these things will bring you to the promised land? Because I think if history proves anything, is that it's not linear. It's often a snake that curls back and bites his own tail. Even if you look at, strangely, the global situation where there is so many, the behavior of Russia, when we thought that was over, and you look at the news and you think, actually, is it over? And I think that is all along. The whole thing is eventually a mix of kind of reactionary remnants and occasional technological changes. And I think, I'm not against parametricism even. Do your thing. But recognize it is your thing. When I start to object is when you start to advocate, let's have the end of pluralism, and parametricism will, cure us all. That to me feels, as easy and as simplistic as clearly, the reinstatement of a United Nations slab against the somewhat interesting skyline is, But I guess truth emerges as the result of overly simplified positions in debates.
Yeah, I have many questions, but one in particular would be the relationship between technology and politics, particularly in 100 years ago, 1914, with the domino, let's say Mason domino diagram. And I'd be curious to hear the panel reflect on what would be the equivalent idea today in architecture and its dominant relationship to politics and the collective.
What's the equivalent to the Mason domino diagram today? The Mason domino diagram is still working. I think it's nice that he mentioned the Mason domino diagram, which is the only thing we know. In 1914, that one drawing, the diagram, has set into motion a project as a drawing, not, for example, the architectural project, the Mason domino. I doubt seriously if anybody in this room would recognize the renderings or the sketches of the houses or the plans of the Mason domino. I regularly show those at lectures and announce them as the most famous project of the 20th century. It's kind of a goof on the audience, and no one knows who they am, not the faculty, not anybody else, and I didn't recognize them. It's just, you only know the drawing because the drawing has all the potentials that Reinier cited, in the sense of it stimulating the imaginations of all of its possibilities in its structural system. But it's the diagram that has stayed alive, and it's the longest living diagram in the history of architecture, and it continues to thrive. And so I don't know that anything has replaced it, because the politics of the diagram is still so engaged. I do think there's reasons to believe, with communities of remote exchange, authentic remote exchange. In other words, we are now seeing the formation of communities no longer based on proximity. And so at the very minimum condition, the communities of the Mason diagram are not familiar with one another, but they're near each other or living in proximity.
But I think it's bankrupt. Of course, there are anachronisms, there's inertia, it kind of continues, but intellectually it's been bankrupt for a long time.
Well, that may be true, but you can't declare something bankrupt if people keep using it. You could say,
well, that's
I
just
understand
inertia.
what you're saying about the same thing about
I can. Intellectually is bankrupt. We need to realize it. For instance, the seriality of its column structure, it's structurally irrational. It used to be rational with respect to the level of rationality attainable at that period, and also in terms of
voting for idiots is structurally irrational. And your country's just done it, my country's just done it. Irrationality is
also socially
the
irrational.
most predictable, rational behavior of human beings.
It's in terms of diagram, it's bankrupt and obsolete, because
let me speak to
just
that
me to
question.
finish why? Because it segregates
can I bring that to
sections.
a broader issue in
There's
your,
no sectional
in
continuity.
your critique of? I'd like to bring this to a slightly larger issue and talk about a little bit of the history of the city. For rational urbanists, believed that cities developed for rational reasons, that people went there for economic reasons. And it turns out that it wasn't until 1850 that the birth rate matched the death rate. So for almost 3,000 years, people went to cities knowing at full risk of that they were putting their lives at risk. And that could not be worked out rationally with the chance to make a better living, since you were taking in chance to die. So current urban theory is that it was not the rational economic decision, but it was the lifestyle decision. Not that you could make more money, but you could occupy more existential niches. I want to be a juggler. I can't make money, I can't make a living as a juggler, but I could go to the city and make a living as a juggler. So it was the proliferation of existential niches, therefore working at a psychological and existential nature, that caused cities to grow, not simply the economic possibilities of making more money. So cities themselves are based on irrational decisions to put your life at risk until the sewer systems of Paris are built in 1850. And
I disagree with that. I disagree with that.
Okay, well, you may disagree with it, but that actually is something you can look up in a book and find the same kind of... This comes from Ulrich Beck.
The interpretation
so you can read this in Ulrich Beck. It's where I learned it.
I understand, but
now, I'm going to finish this with one more point. That means, the question is, you seem to have a confidence in science that you can figure out, use science to calculate all the behaviors of humanity and parameterize it. So recently I read in Scientific American, now they rarely, and I'll give you the reference, it's called the article on magic. So the 23 of the world's greatest neuroscientists invite Randy Apollo, who is a magician and pickpocket, and they invite him to explain to them how he does his work. And he goes in to Princeton, and he sits with 23 of the world's top neuroscientists, and he systematically explains how he picks their pockets, how he steals their watches. He explains, for example, that if I squeeze this wrist for a second, it will be numb for a second. Then if I use a distraction, touch this wrist, then I can take this watch. He does this for 45 minutes, and as he's doing this, at the end of it, he walks up to the front of the stage, and he dumps every watch, every wallet, all the pocket money from all the people he's just got through explaining exactly how he did it to. So the point of this is that acquired knowledge of each disciplinary expertise over time, practical science, is far more effective and far more, the content of it is much greater than any scientific investigation of human behavior at the moment is. So architects know so much more about how people behave and live and work and respond to it, the parametrics of any, I mean, on this, Reinier and I are just absolutely tied. Now, there may be circumstances evolving in the world, like remote communities of exchange, and that what it's like, you know, if you are going down a ROM plan 40 years ago, it was fantastic. If you're going down with a ROM plan and you're texting, you're about to break your leg. You know, so changes of inattention fields, those things we have to take into account. But our knowledge of the relationship of our discipline to the behaviors of, we're not going to learn more from careful parametric studies the kind of stuff you're advocating. It's just not true.
No, we of course, I respect tacit knowledge, intuitive knowledge and handling of
There's nothing intuitive about this. This is acquired, practical knowledge from
Well, I'm calling it intuitive and distinguish it from an analytically penetrated and made explicit and then translated knowledge. And I agree with you that these things go hand in hand, they come together, but at the same time, there is a project which makes sense, and it is actually deliver the civilization, television, telephony, etc., on the basis, of course, of science. And we need to build on that, and we can't derogate it. That makes no sense. But I was asked the question outside as well. I mean, how much veracity can we make these simulations and things? Surprising degrees of veracity, because these are just pattern predictions, not where exactly person A or B is standing or resting, but the kind of pattern of clumping we, for instance, saw outside there in the lobby is a pattern we can kind
The other thing,
of
Patrick,
predict
is
and generate.
even with
and simulate.
simulations, meaning, for example, most persons in a...
That we can also quantify them. If you simulate them, we can actually then quantify them and be precise and specific about it. Yes, you can say, I rest with my intuition and I will make a few pencil doodles. I will make a few pencil doodles. That is no longer sufficient when we're talking about a corporate campus with literally 5,000 to 10,000 people with different specialisms, trajectory schedules, multiple audiences. That can no longer be intuited.
But I don't think Jeff is talking about
use the
intuition.
intuitions of individual instances and build a complex system.
Well...
So I don't know what your point was,
I'm
Jeff.
definitely not talking about
What
that.
was your point?
My point is...
You denying the possibility? You're staying with the pencil and the bubble diagram? With some labels?
I think I made my point.
Sorry to push it.
Kind of like Theo says, you've got technology is here, you can choose not to use it, but it's here, you have to deal with it. And with your system, and how are we going to do? Where do I exist? Where is human? Where? It seems so over-engineered and utopian at the same time, which is what sort of scares me. It makes me want to join David Chatfield.
Well, I mean, I'm sure.
But believe it, he is a very nice man, as we've heard. But also,
he is,
he
and
is
I have to apologize to David.
he is an
Nice guy.
inveterate drunk.
He is personally perfectly rational human being.
But he is a drunk. I mean, he drinks all the time.
But
That's Will Alsop.
but
That is Will Alsop. I
but
mean, I
Cynthia,
There's plenty of good ways to resist.
I just want to speculate. All these, you want.
Happily do.
The question was addressed to me, I suspect. You were worried about the social engineering, and
I
it
think
becomes
people
kind
have a tough time
Yes, we
actually
are worried.
distinguishing
Theo, maybe
Patrick
Theo
and
can
me.
answer as well.
No, I mean, Reinier is bridging our worlds together.
Okay.
I'm interested in resistance, but I'll put this conversation that Jeff and Patrick have also in the mix. So, for example, like we could make arguments about algorithms and so forth, but today we deploy algorithms to construct and interact with other algorithms, and we're left in a moment where we get results, but we have no capacity to understand how they come. So we're in a world where we put a lot of things out there without the capacity to conceptualize what that is. So we're operating in a strangely black box kind of way of thinking. And I agree that there needs to be resistance. I'm arguing, I think, very much for a participatory model. I'm not basically saying that systems have to be prescriptive in a very top-down command and control perspective. I think that they need to be participatory. I think that they do have to have that capacity, but that's not necessarily talking about like community design. It's talking about different sort of ideas of complexity that are emerging and trying to develop some strategies that doesn't necessarily render, I mean, Reinier was mentioning about linear histories and my interests in technology, but the reality of those things is it's not that if technologies are there, you know, there's a future that's calculated by them. To be honest with you, there's a lot of resistance to anything that's different because things are very habitual.
But what
And I think architecture should challenge.
Indolence, ignorance.
I think all of that stuff is at play in our
Dust.
contemporary
You
society.
showed 2 vacuum cleaners.
I
Without
did.
the dust, the reason most of our kids have asthma today is because of you dust-free people. You know, I mean, these things in the city.
Yeah, I'm not basically
But-
saying
but
that they
there
should
are
be
no
roboticized.
forms
I'm basically
of
saying
human
But
behavior
they're not
that
scary
are-
things
All-
because
all
they're
I'm
premised
saying-
on freedom, on total individual freedom of
But
moving
you're
and
gonna
expression.
parametrize and
No, but I'm just saying,
They're not
I mean,
they're not
just to
controlling.
Cynthia's,
the freedom bump.
to Cynthia's comment, I mean, all I'm saying is that things have agency in themselves. And those things are part of our everyday, and we interact with them, and they sort of observe us, and I think we can raise the level of conversation and construct actually forms of resistance, as you put it, if we acknowledge that those things are at play. I think when we talk about all of these other technologies, they happen every day to us, Except when we talk about architecture being an active participant, maybe architecture is that resistance, but it's not resistance in the same way of sort of stating like it's the difference between a generic blank facade versus, let's say, noise of kind of different architectural forms. There's something else at play. And I think we could recognize that if we want to. If we pretend like it doesn't exist, that's also fine. But that's more of the same.
But I would say that, the thing I showed is not a form of resistance. It's not any form of truth. That building we made at that particular time, in that particular context, inspired by a particular irritation we had. It's not to say we would do the same building again anywhere else. And there's a big difference here between the argument for parametricism and our gratuitous joke in the middle of Dubai. So, in fact, it was a very contextual building. And it didn't react to its context with curve or anything, but it's very contextual in the sense that it reacted to a prevailing culture and a prevailing mood in that particular time. And I honestly think that architecture and resistance have a very difficult relationships, because primarily architecture thrives on inspiration. It thrives on embracing new technologies and etc. and see what you can try. Architecture is essentially the pickpocket. That its intelligence stems from operationalizing very often the breakthroughs and ideas created in other domains and by others. And for architecture in itself, because I could resist what I understand, because if I understand it, I can decide whether I like it or I don't like it. I think the status of a lot of the smart technologies, like the black box you describe, you don't know, you don't exactly know, and therefore you don't exactly know what to resist or even if to resist. And then you develop, the ultimate resistance you then develop is against the potential dependency on something that you don't know where it's going. And technology can always go one way or the other. It's in the end what you do with it. And I feel with a lot of this stuff, it's still so fairly recent that is nowhere clear. I see some exciting things. I see some scary. And I think it is maybe in debates like this, it may be sensible to be a little less absolute and be a little more humble. In terms of, I think the whole thing is essentially still subject to extremely speculative interpretation.
This from a guy whose people walked all over Europe, said none of this is good enough, built their own little island, took over the entire world. I mean, there's something, aren't you the technological masters of the universe, right?
I am not. I mean, you're talking about somebody else than me, first of all.
No, I mean, I'm just joking. They are the most, that's an instrumental culture of, I'm saying this in a profound way, to know that you can change the world with that level of instrumentality and to do that with a kind of positive project. I mean, this is why I think we can't, this is what I'm saying about, I don't think we need to decide the intelligence. I think Patrik's intelligence is something we celebrate, your intelligence is something we celebrate, and Theo's intelligence is something we celebrate. I do agree that it's really important to get together and discuss it and talk about it. And what ends up happening about that is we don't ask them to decide. We ask them to organize according to which group they follow. So however much we're here to recruit, none of us are going to be successful. All of us are going to be partially successful except Peter.
We're not talking about architecture.
So, Reinier, you sort of cautioned against romanticizing dictatorships and their ability to build. And I'm wondering how you would respond to the argument that by working with these countries and these regimes, architecture is actually promoting social change and bringing attention and perhaps pushing not towards the all-yellow pseudo-democracy map that you showed at the end, but promoting an all-blue map where there is social change through architectural expression and exposure.
Well, I think it's a number of things, because, this is, of course, a question that emerges a lot, given the fact that we indiscriminately involve ourselves into practically everything, a few exceptions there. There is a difference between engaging and endorsing, first of all. And I think the current, globalized world is so interdependent that a position of refusal or a position of purely observation is very, very problematic. I mean, we separate observation and and the operative in the context of our own practice, meanwhile in two different firms, which are of course part of the same holding, part of the same thing, serve the same economic interest at the same way, but this is something that's become very necessary because the world has essentially come like that. There is no more outside, so there is no more inside to kick against in an indiscriminate way. We are extremely selective, actually, in what we do and what we don't. Every Monday morning we go through lists of people, competitions, they ask us to do things, do we do it, do we don't do it, very esoteric discussions. But I mean, the interesting thing is that these discussions are never categorical. We won't just work in the blue or just work in the yellow. They're really decided on a case-by-case, opportunistic, in a good sense of the word, way, partially driven by the same type of knowledge acquired in practice that you're describing about, which gives you a gut feeling. In a case like China, every situation in the end is a neck and neck race between good forces and bad forces. Whether it's the middle. Sorry, can I finish?
Yeah. I wanted to ask.
Sorry. Every situation is a neck and neck race between good and the bad forces, and it's very complex. You can't just categorically choose either one of the systems, but you have to kind of make an assessment on the spot which one of the two you are helping and what the likelihood is that the end outcome will indeed help, what you think is right.
Can I ask you, because I know it's apparently in bad form, but I like to have a discussion with the audience because a lot of the things you say provoke really interesting questions for me. So when you see a journalistic map of 3 colors that show that divide the entire world into 3 electoral attitudes, do you stop and feel any resistance at all that say something like, well, that's probably good for a 5-minute lecture, but do I take that very seriously, or do I think about that a little bit, or do I just give myself over to it? Because then you ask a question about the conclusion that he uses in a journalistic moment, as if you're going to walk away with that as something serious you should think about, that silly little piece of color graphics. Because now I'm going to ask you, what are the 3 currencies that make the word yes? Yen, euro, and dollar. Do you think those are really important currencies today? Well, I know, but you are. And this is what's worrying me about cheap journalistic gimmicks, like making the building way too big so that it covers 2/3 of the frame and then calling it simple. Whereas there's the exact same building in that whole group on the side that if you just took that building off, you can see it. Or sticking a building in the middle of the bay that turns and saying it's simple. So all these little tricks, which make a really great architectural practice work really well, or a real good journalist very effective in a lecture, and trust me, I do them in spades, you're supposed to resist. You're supposed to think a little bit about it. They had America up there as one kind of electoral thing. We're a democratic electorate because we vote. Now, is that how you're sensing the news, where 95% of the money that's being given to the vote, that goes into the votes come from 40 families? Is that how you feel about us? Do you feel like we're free, fair, democratic elective when the Republican, when voters' rights are being changed? Do you feel that map fairly conveys electoral politics in the world in 3 colors? The answer, you don't have to say it, I don't have to say it, but you get the point. His point's well made in the context of just a small argument, momentarily. But if you start thinking about and formulating questions about what's going to stop us from turning the world all yellow, then I get worried. Then I want to have a conversation with you about the difference between a journalistic argument and a genuine argument about electoral politics in the world. I'm not blaming him.
Are we talking about, I'm just curious,
But
whether this discussion in the last 40 minutes
that's gone off track.
is talking about the art of architecture. I'm thinking, if my students came into class and started jabbering like this, I'd say, hey, draw me something, you know, show me.
Let's see what you drew.
No, you can't see what I drew. Anyway, what I'm worried about is we're all very intelligent. I have nothing against any of the intelligence that has been spoken, but I'm not certain that I would be astonished by any of the architectural results. I'm not certain that I would have an epiphany. And that's why I started my talk today with the fact that it's possible that architecture can astonish, and that there is a possibility of heroes. I think what all of us have been talking about are incrementally taking the world and raising it to a certain level, but I don't think it's a level of great work. And I think our culture, whether people realize it or not, needs great architecture. And I don't think we're talking about that and how we arrive at those things. I don't think we can do them through statistics, through charts, etc. We got to do them by lots of rolls of tracing paper still. You know, I really believe that. And I watch my people in my office move these computer models around, and they sit there like this. I think, what the hell are they doing? You know. And I'm a troglodyte. You know. I still believe that design is important, and when I take my students, as we did last week, on a 6-hour bus ride to see one painting, just so they experience what that would be like to see the flagellation, a teeny little goddamn painting, no bigger than this, and they rode 6 hours in a bus. I hope they understand what the hell it's about. And I don't think we've talked about one analogous to one painting tonight and said that would be important. And there are examples all over this town of those kinds of buildings that have existed. And I don't know if we learn from those things or not, because I don't see any new buildings that have gone up in this town that have the capacity to astonish as some of the older buildings. And I feel, I just had to say this, guys, because I don't feel we're talking about architecture. And when Patrik, really get me upset when you say that the domino diagram is bankrupt. I wrote about a 30-page essay on why the domino diagram has no bankruptcy today. We're not talking about a structural system. We're talking about a formal organization of space and time, which is one of the most magnificent creatures, and we haven't gotten anything close to that. And I teach that. And to say that grids are bankrupt, let's say, it's like saying that. And I say to myself, how can that possibly be? And I think you go sometimes overboard for me because I don't think it's bankrupt, and I don't think you think that, or you wouldn't be doing the work that you're doing.
I want to come back with this. You talked about these epiphanies when architecture starts to astonish, where it grips you, and this might not be a lived architecture, this might be a diagram, an opportunity, a potential, and you delivered some of them. And I think they're not coming in spades every month, they're coming every few decades, perhaps.
Yeah.
They sometimes cluster, and the ones I find superbly memorable, two of them are from you. One is the Venice project, and the possibility, which was to me up to that point unknown, of superimposing multiple reference systems and have them competing in the same space rather than next to it and adjacent to it, was a monumental shock of revelation, and we were all running with it. I mean, we came home to it through your work, and then Schumi just made it didactically that one more level clearer, but I know where its origin of such a MOOC were, and how you arrived at this, we don't know. This is that's the evolution, that's mutation, random, but then the meaning of this is important for me. It's the shock, the unusual, the new potential, but also then, for me, the instrumentalization, how that makes sense in a civilization where you have domains of competency and incorporation not being tiled next to each other, but being interpenetrating. And it makes sense with respect to the time. The next one was the fold, and folding, and this idea of a not just substance integrating of a proliferating surface which wraps and modulates and integrates a series of otherwise collage entities under one kind of unifying, modulated, differentiated substrate. And that was a shock of revelation. And we instrumentalists, we run with this, and again, it makes sense in a society where we don't have not only interpenetrating the domains of competency, but gradients and bleedings and crystallizations. These are the breakthroughs. These are the things where eminently architectural, and to some extent I feel that you've been able to deliver these because you didn't at the same time simultaneously worry about its programmatic performance and meaning. You were the great formalist and repertoire innovator of the second half of the 20th century because you thought yourself as somebody who thinks of this as an autonomous domain. The composition repertoire is expanded. And that's what I respect you, and that's for you the essence of architecture.
The question that I would raise with you, with Theo, with Reinier, is it autonomous? In other words, is the idea of a corner, both an external corner, and is a corner unique to what we do? They're not corners in sculpture, painting, music, etc. They're corners. And don't students have to know how to make a corner, right? Do they know how to make, a stair, whatever? And, to me, what I found, I mean, I say this to Reinier, not as for him, but my critique of what Rem got at in the Biennale on the fundamentals, I believe that he was onto something. But the thing that's important about fundamentals is the syntactic, in other words, how do you put them together? What are the rules of linguistic operation that we as architects deal with? And we're in a world where those things are equally as important as stairs, roofs, corners, etc. How do you put them together? And I think that was my one critique of the Biennale.
No, it's very, very true. I mean, it's something I recognize as a potential, as a critique of that whole thing, that it's ultimately about the integration of what is presented as separate elements there. But to your point,
how do you do that? Well, how do you see? That's what still fascinates me, because here we have a group of people who do teach and practice. How do we teach integration?
I did have a question for Peter Eisenman, and perhaps tying with the rest of the panel. You did build a wonderful career problematizing knowledge, putting it at bay, forever displacing it, and going so far even to decompose compositions, so as to keep knowledge always at a very sort of distant spot, that we can always reach for it, and in reaching for it, we know and learn something new. And I was wondering if you, in looking at, say, Theo's work today, that you see something along those lines, but using a different medium altogether. That there is an experimentation, an exploration into the unknown without necessarily having a cause, sort of an effect before a cause can come through, so that we can all grow and expand accordingly.
Well, what I would always ask a Theo or a Patrik is how do you choose when you have an infinite range of possibilities from an algorithm? In other words, an algorithm gives you a set of X permutations. I forget who was the guy that came with the 50 chairs to Yale last year, the Frenchman. The guy comes and he
Philippe
says,
Morel.
what?
Philippe Morel.
Yeah, Philippe Morel. And I say, hey, Philippe, how do you choose? And I think, you know how you choose? Because you've got the guts to choose, you've got the sensibility, and somehow you believe that your capacity to choose is better than anybody else's, and that's why you do it. And I think that Patrik, I don't believe this stuff about parametricism. I don't even believe it with Theo, because I believe those guys are choosers, right? And they choose, and they win because they choose right, okay? And the rest of it's, for me, obfuscation, okay? Because you can say whatever you want. We all have our methods, you know, diagrams or whatever, you know. And the same with almost practice. You know, they say we make diagrams, and they choose the right diagram, right? And what does it mean to choose the right diagram or the right chair? It means you have a sensibility that has been trained to a certain level. And I think that's what we have to realize. All of these people here, they can make as many algorithms as they want and diagrams as they want. How do they learn to choose? And how does education, the schools, do that for them and for us? And I say, I don't have the answers. I mean, my students say, why don't you, and this is where I was getting at Jeff today, my students say, well, why don't you talk about the last 20 years and give us, instead of Brunelleschi and Bramante, why don't you give us Herzog and de Meuron, and give us Cope Himmelblau, and give us Frank Gehry? And I said, because I wouldn't know how to teach them. I don't know what the lessons are. Honestly, I love...
Would you know how to teach us? Because you left us out in your little
that's
summary.
Different. I didn't put you in there.
Yeah. So what are we on to something here? Are we on to something? That's, yeah, I was waiting, but it didn't come. So would you be able to teach us?
What?
Would you be able to teach us? Yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
But there's
I haven't witnessed it, so I don't know about ability.
Yeah.
But
so what's the difference? Why am I able to do that?
I was thinking about your corner, and we use corners in abundance. And if parametricism had its way, there will not be corners for very much longer. And you know, architecture is different from painting, because painting you make and you sell it or you don't sell it. Architecture, you do need clients. You know, we ban the word from internal discussions in the office, but it doesn't mean they're not there. And architecture is a form of language. It's as much a discourse in itself as the discourse that with a lot of words we make them accommodate. But architecture is a form of operationalized discourse where you need a corner because somebody else before you used the corner, somebody else before you used the corner, and your corner only makes sense, is only original, measured against the way the corner was used elsewhere. So it's undeniably, irrespective of the stardom, the myth of individual genius, the work is part of a tradition. I have another thing, if you'd allow me. There was recently an exhibition at the Fondazione Prada about Roman statues and how they have been replicated, miniaturized in the Renaissance, etc., etc. And I thought it was very interesting. We worked with that fashion brand for a long time, that they apparently look at Roman statues because they need inspiration for the next line of clothes, and then they look at smaller statues for the other line of clothes. But I got to know more about Roman sculptures than from all the history books I had to learn in school, etc., simply because there was a vulgar ulterior motive to the opera, the making operational kind of parts of classical culture.
But you had the possibility, right? You had the possibility to make those decisions because you're new enough to do that. And if I take somebody off the street and I say, here, you choose from Roman sculptures, they won't. There's a certain level of, and Jeff hates this, of expertise that is required. And it takes time to learn it. You can't, if you say to somebody like you, if I say, okay, write a poem, and you've never read a poem, how would you do it? You couldn't do it. So unless we know what is architecture and how it's transformed and how we can transform it, we can't do anything. So we're not innocents. That's all I'm saying, is that all in the audience, and all of us are not, we're all trying to move toward some sort of opening the discipline up to more inventiveness, more, whatever, to use the technologies for what purpose? To make better, not, I don't think more functional, I think more culturally aware environments that are necessary to the sustaining of the culture.
Yeah, I think that's quite right, and I agree with this. And what sustains a culture might be certain spatiality, it might need more complexity than an older paradigm would deliver. So I very much believe in intuition, what you're saying, and I believe that we have to choose, and we are trained to choose on the basis of intuition and sensibility, and aesthetic sensibility. But also at the same time, we need to sometimes unlearn and relearn a new sensibility, because a contemporary sensibility is different from the modernist sensibility. And then somebody has to stand back and analyze, why is that new sensibility now giving me a better chance to pick something culturally attuned?
Yeah.
And there is the possibility, and that's what I just offer you. I'm not going to convince you now that there is an analytic penetration of such decisions.
Patrik, here's what I would, let's take the four of us here, put Jeff Kipnis up here, 5, put the whole audience up here and say, okay, you got 7 hours, you got 15 students, you're in Vicenza or you're in Firenze, what do you do in that 7 hours, right? I made the choice to get them on a damn bus, drive them 3 hours to Urbino, see the painting for an hour, drive them 3 hours back. Now, that's a choice I made that I thought was important. A lot of other people would say, how else to spend 7 hours?
Thanks, everybody, for sticking around.